Hi everyone, welcome to this YouTube channel. My name is Levi Cosijn, and for you today I have again Anthony Lewis. This is our, I think our fifth conversation. Hi Anthony, how are you?
Hi, good to see you.
It's great to see you. Today we're going to talk about dignity, which is a huge subject. We've already been discussing this for 15 minutes now, and so I decided to push the record button.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand you prepared some slides. I also have some stuff to share from the Vedic angle, the way, true dignity is determined. But we're also, of course, interested in where it all comes from. Like, for example, in Vedic astrology, we use, to determine true dignity, we use a combination of natural planetary relationships and also temporary relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'd like to interject here and talk a little bit about the Vedic perspective on dignity. I'm going to read from a book I co-authored, Astrology Explained, Ancient Principles for the Modern Mind. With that in mind, we shall proceed to describing the true dignity of a planet, which, as we will see, is the combination between its natural and temporary dignity. Planets rule certain signs called own signs or domicile. When in those signs, we consider them swashta, or self-abiding, meaning healthy, confident, and comfortable. Planets perform even better in their exaltation sign and mula trikona, where they perform their best. In fact, the graha is said to be in deepta, or radiant, and garvita, or proud condition. When in this state, the planet becomes very productive and it produces direct results. Grahas are also debilitated in certain signs where they are said to be in a kala state, or low, alarmed, or pressed, or depressed state. And this is a graph of all the planets with their exaltation and the deep degree and so on. Natural friendships or relationships. The strength of a planet in a sign depends upon its relationship with the ruler of the sign in which it is located. As we already noted, planets are strong in their exaltation, mula trikona, or own signs. For other signs, there is a system of planetary relationships that measures the connection between planets. And Parashara, which Brihat Parashara Shastra, which is one of the authoritative texts that we use in Vedic astrology, gives the rule to calculate natural friendships. From a grahas, mula trikona, from a planet's mula trikona, and mula means root, right? So where the planets, that specific area in the zodiac where the planet draws its strength from. The owner of the 4th, 2nd, 12th, 5th, 9th, and 8th, as well as the lord of its exaltation Rashi, are friendly. Inimical are the others. Neutral are those that indicate both friendly on one count and inimical on another count, which may happen for those grahas that rule 2 Rashis. Okay, so the 2nd, 4th, 5th, 8th, 9th, and 12th position, as well as the exaltation lord of the Rashi, are friendly. That's important. So a planet that rules the 3rd and the 11th, for example, is going to become inimical, right? A planet that rules the 2nd and the 11th is going to be neutral, because the 2nd is part of the friendly placement, the 11th is an inimical placement, all right? So, but I'll give an example. Let's look at Mars. Mars has its mula trikona between the first 12 degrees of Aries. So the 4th placement is Cancer. Cancer is ruled by the moon. This is a friendly placement, so the moon becomes a friend towards Mars. Right? It's always the planet towards the one in mula trikona. Venus rules the 2nd and the 7th. The 2nd is part of the friendly placements, and the 7th is not. So this becomes neutral, right? So one friend and one neutral. One friend, one inimical becomes neutral. The 3rd and the 6th are ruled by Mercury, and these are both inimical placements, and so Mercury becomes inimical towards Mars, right? Mercury is the only enemy of Mars. The Sun is, of course, rules the 5th from Mars, and thus becomes a friend towards Mars. So the Sun is a natural friend of Mars. Then here, Scorpio, Mars has its domicile there. Jupiter rules the 9th and the 12th from Mars. These are 2 placements favorable. So Jupiter becomes a friend, a natural friend of Mars. And then Mars has its exaltation Rashi here, right? It's exaltation in Capricorn, and the 11th is inimical. So we have one favorable, one inimical, becomes neutral. So Saturn becomes neutral towards Mars. Okay. So this is how we determine natural friendships. Here there's a list. Jupiter is neutral towards the moon, but the moon is a friend of Jupiter, right? So it's not always reciprocal, right? Here we have The moon is a friend to the sun, but the sun is also a friend to the moon. Here it is reciprocal. But then moon and Mercury, for example, moon is inimical towards Mercury, but Mercury is a friend towards the moon. This is all based on this rule given by Parashara. Okay, and of course, there's also different opinions on depending on what text you read. And then temporary relationships. Besides natural friendships, the placement of planets within a chart will determine temporary relationships and planetary dignities. True dignity is determined by combining natural planetary relationships and temporal planetary relationships. Signs located in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 12th, 11th, and 10th from the sign in which a planet is located in a chart, counting that Rashi or that sign as the first, are its temporary friends. And so they will help each other in fulfilling their tasks. And any planet in another position is going to be inimical. So it's very easy to see when you look at the South Indian chart style. So let's look at Mars here. Any planet that is in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, right, from Mars here. And so we include Mars. Mars is the first sign, or Leo is the first sign, or the 12th, 11th, or 10th are going to be temporary friends. All the other placements are going to be inimical. Okay, so this is including Saturn here, which is conjuncting Mars. It's going to be inimical. It's going to be a temporary enemy. Sun, Venus, and Mercury also are temporary enemies. But Jupiter and Moon here are temporary friends because Jupiter is in the 11th and the Moon is in the 10th from Mars. And then, of course, we only include the planets that we can see with the naked eye, right? So combined relationships, both natural and temporal friendships have to be combined to get an accurate measure of the relationships between planets in any specific chart. We will also add a mathematical way to assess the strength of a planet's dignity, which is expressed in virupas, which is the Sanskrit for points. This is on a scale from 0 to 60, so 1 rupa is 60 virupas. Exaltation, Dipta or Garvita Vasta is 60 virupas, right, is the maximum. Mula Trikona is a little less. Well, it's actually a lot less, right? So this, you'll see this curve drastically decreasing. Own sign has 30 virupas out of 60, right? This is a planet in own sign. So I think here there's some differences of opinion, right? When we look at the old authors. Natural friend and temporary friend becomes a great friend, which is called Pramudita, which is a Diptarya Vasta. This is when a planet is delighted or happy. This is 22 virupas. Natural neutral or temporary friend, natural neutral plus temporary friend becomes a friend or Shanta, which means serene, right? When a planet is in a friend's dignity. This is 15 virupas. That's already a lot less, right? You know what a planet in a friend's dignity can actually do. Natural enemy plus temporary friend becomes neutral or dinas, which means scarce, right? Which is 8 virupas. And natural friend plus temporary enemy is the same thing. Natural neutral plus temporary enemy is a planet in an enemy sign, right? Or Dukkita, which means miserable. It's only 4 virupas. A natural enemy plus a temporary enemy is a great enemy, which is the same, Dukkita or miserable, but it only has 2 virupas. And a planet in debilitation is in Kala, Vasta, or Prest, right, which has is completely crashed, has 0 virupas. So, own sign, Mula Trikona, exaltation, and debilitation dignities are not subject to temporary or combined change. Only friend, neutral, and enemy can shift into one another. Neutral to friend or enemy, friend to great friend or neutral, enemy to neutral or great enemy. Also interesting, right? We can see that there are 5 favorable dignities: exaltation, matrikona, own house, great friend, and friend. 1 neutral dignity and 3 unfavorable dignities, which are enemy, great enemy, and debilitation. Considering there are more krura planets or cruel planets, the malefics, right? Mars, Saturn, Rahu, Ketu, and the waning moon. Then Samya Grahas, or the gentle Grahas, Venus, Jupiter, and the waxing moon. Having more favorable than unfavorable dignities also shows that there are more favorable than unfavorable events in life, regardless of their cruel or gentle nature, right? So let's look at another example. Here we have the sun in Aries, in Cancer. The moon is a natural friend towards the sun, and then the moon is in the 12th from the sun's Rashi, so it becomes a temporary friend. So friend plus friend is going to be a great friend, right? So the sun is in a great friend's dignity. So here in terms of second house stuff and resources and so on, it can be favorable, okay? This is, the core of what the Vedic Vedic astrology has to say about dignity. Of course, in Vedic astrology, we use divisional charts. There's 16 charts that are used. Of course, there's many ideas and differences of opinion of how to calculate them and so on. But these divisional charts show the different areas in a person's life, right? Like the Saptamsha, this D7 chart is a specific way of dividing the sign, the zodiac. The Navamsha is of course crucial and very important, which deals with your path, your dharma, right? And so all these planets are going to have different dignities in these Vargas, but it is all calculated from your natal horoscope or Rashi chart. Where does it all come from?
Okay, well, let me start by saying how I got into dignities. Back in the 80s, I got seriously interested in William Lilly and his approach to horary astrology.
Mm-hmm.
And in his approach, the dignity of planets is very important. And so I first learned about dignities from William Lilly's work, and then have been interested and read a lot about it. You know, there's some stuff we know, and I think there's some stuff we don't know and probably will never know because it's lost to history. I'm going to be presenting a Western, Hellenistic, or horary kind of approach, which is somewhat different than the Vedic approach, although there's a lot of similarities. Okay, well, let me start with the first slide here. Planetary dignity. So I put a picture of the Queen here because we consider her to be a very dignified lady, right? Or most people do, I should say. And part of that is natural. She was born into a royal family, so there's a natural element to her dignity. She comes, we would call that essential dignity. It's part of her nature. She didn't earn it. She just was born into it. And part of being dignified has to do with behavior. How will she behave? And because we think she's a dignified woman, we expect she will behave in a certain way in a public function, for instance. And dignity has a lot to do with the behavior of the planets. So when a planet's dignified, we expect it to behave well according to its nature. And when it loses dignity, we expect it to behave badly, still in accord with its nature, but not in the best manner possible. Okay. Etymology of the word dignity, at least in English, I always find it helpful to look up these words and see where they came from.
Absolutely.
And dignity comes from a Latin word dignitas, means worthiness, merit, dignity, grandeur, authority, rank, office. It has to do with being worthy or appropriate, deserving honor or esteem, and acting in a fitting way. And a synonym would be worth or worthiness. Definitions of dignity. So as I was saying about the Queen, a dignified person or planet will behave with decorum in a proper, fitting, and appropriate manner. So if a planet is dignified in your chart, you expect it to behave well, to do what it's supposed to do in an appropriate way. And so by its behavior, it will be worthy, or it will deserve our respect, esteem. It will deserve being in a high office, having authority. And a place where a planet is dignified is where it can act according to its nature without interference and in an appropriate manner. Synonyms for or definitions of dignity: calm, serious, controlled behavior that makes people respect you, the importance and value that a person or a planet has, that other people respect them or makes them respect themselves. Okay. Now, in Western astrology, we generally distinguish essential from accidental, which I think the terms you use are what temporal is one, and what's the other? Natural?
So natural friendships and temporal.
Okay. So natural and temporal would be equivalent to essential and accidental. Essentially has to do with the nature of the planet itself or the nature of the zodiac, because certain regions of the zodiac naturally are places where a planet will do well or do badly.
Yes.
And accidental dignity refers to everything else. A planet could be dignified because it's in an angular house, or because it's traveling quickly, or because it's aspected by a benefic planet, or There are many, many ways a planet can be accidentally or temporally dignified. It has to do with where it happens to be at the time and what else is influencing it.
Mm-hmm.
And for instance, in Hellenistic astrology, they use this word krematistikos, meaning busy, like a busy marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
And so a planet in an angular house would be like someone who goes to the market and there's lots of hustle and bustle and wheeling and dealing, and it's doing a lot. So
Yes.
that would be a form of dignity. It's very active, able to get things done, able to negotiate, buy things, sell things, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Marinus, who's one of my favorite astrologers,
Mm-hmm.
he makes this interesting distinction between virtue and strength. Because often in the literature, I think people confuse dignity with strength or power.
Mm-hmm.
And it's possible that a planet could be very dignified but have very little strength.
Mm-hmm.
Or a planet can be very undignified and have a lot of strength. You know, like a despotic leader could act in a very undignified, you know, killing all his opponents, murdering people, but have a lot of power. And so Marinus says that the strength of a planet should be differentiated from its virtue. He uses the word virtue. Virtue refers to the planet's essential nature, where strength is the quantity. Whoops, that should be quantity, not quantify, of such virtue.
Mm-hmm.
And he gives the example, suppose you have a magnet that's able to attract iron, it can pick up iron, that the nature of the magnet is to attract iron through a magnetic force. But its strength, some magnets are stronger than others. They all will attract iron, but some will do it more powerfully than others. So they all have the same virtue, which is the natural ability, but they have different strengths.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a good distinction.
Yeah.
Now, Lilly and most Western books distinguish 5 primary principal essential dignities. Domicile, which is the sign that the planet rules. And the idea is that if a planet rules a sign, it's in charge. It has access to all the resources of that sign, and it will carry out whatever that sign represents in your life. And if that sign is a particular house in your chart, it will carry out the matters of that house for you. Exaltation. This is a sign, and there's a particular degree in the sign, but they were usually for the whole sign, in which the planet is particularly respected and people do its bidding. So it's like, it's compared to sitting on a throne. So if you are in your exaltation, you're not necessarily in your own household, you're not in your own home, but you're in a place where people, you're like an honored guest. They want to do what you want. So you have all these people going out of their way to help you get done whatever you want done. That's exaltation. Triplicity refers to, there are 3 signs in each triplicity: fire signs, earth signs, air signs, water signs. And so the triplicities, there are 3 planets that rule the triplicities, the 3 signs together considered as a unit or as a group.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a form of dignity. And I think this is comparable to the Mulaka Trikona concept in Vedic, that you're talking the root of the trine. There's a trine of signs, and there's one region that seems to be the root of all that. That's,
Yes.
but in Western, they actually talk about 3, at least the original Hellenistic idea. There are 3 triplicity lords. There are 3 signs: 1 lord for the daytime, 1 lord for the nighttime, and 1 lord that participates both day and night.
I think that's interesting. I personally do not know where the Mula Trikona, because Mula means root, and so
Right.
each planet has a Mula Trikona position, so it's where the planet draws its strength.
Trikona is a group of 3 signs, right? It's
Sure.
the 3 of the same element.
Yes, but the thing is, what I wonder is, what I don't know is where Mula Trikona positions actually come from. I know there's an explanation from the sidereal angle, but I haven't really come across a satisfying explanation to really determine, and also because this is, referring to specific degrees, like,
Right.
Mars between 0 and 12 in Vedic, and in Hellenistic, it's between 0 and 19, or something like that. And so where does this come from? Of course, we know that Mars, for example, has its Mula Trikona in Aries, which is a masculine sign. Most planets have the Mula Trikona position in masculine signs, but the moon doesn't, and Mercury doesn't either. So it's difficult to understand really what is the reasoning behind all this
Right.
mathematically.
Yeah. And I don't know.
Me neither, I'm looking
Right.
for it, and I've asked many people.
Well, maybe we'll come up with some ideas as we keep going. So the fourth type of essential dignity is the term or bound. So each sign is divided into 5 unequal segments, one for each of the 5 non-luminary planets.
Yes.
And that's a region of the sign in which that planet has a special type of dignity called term. And the fifth type of dignity is what's called the face or decan or decanate, which is each sign is divided into 10 degrees.
Yes.
And that's considered sort of the weakest or least important type of essential dignity. So let me just go over them quickly. I'm quoting here from Lily Domicile. When a planet is in a sign that it rules, it has dignity by domicile. Lily regarded this as the most important, most significant, and most powerful, impressive type of dignity. When the planet is in his own house, meaning his own sign, it represents, he always gives this sort of a human analogy, a man in such condition that he is lord of his own house, estate, and fortune, wanting very little of the goods of the world. He has all the resources he needs. In a very happy state or condition. He's happy because he's in his own home and he has everything he wants. And this will be true unless there's some accidental debility, like being retrograde, combust, afflicted by a malevolent planet, etc.
Yeah, in Vedic astrology, this is referred to as svashta, which means self-abiding. This is one of the Daryavasa, confident, self-abiding is what we use for it. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Here's my image of dignity by domicile. A man's home is his castle. So here, this guy has dignity by domicile. I like these visual images because they help you remember things.
Definitely.
Now are you familiar with this chart, the Thema Mundi?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
But maybe it's good to explain it anyway, because this is very, very interesting. Yeah.
So in Hellenistic astrology, and I'm not sure what most people say, this is a Hellenistic concept. I'm not sure if it came from the Hellenistic astrologers from elsewhere, but let's assume this is from the Hellenistic astrologers. So 2,000, 2,500 years ago. It was a teaching chart for the beginning of the universe. The theory was it's not a real chart. They don't really think that the universe began this way, like if you calculate it astronomically. But the idea was at the beginning of time, when our solar system first formed, the signs were arranged like this, and the planets were arranged like this. The idea being the sign Cancer was rising with Leo about to follow. And the speculation why Cancer and Leo, one speculation that I like, which may or may not be true, is that the Hellenistic astrologers kind of centered around Alexandria, Egypt.
Yeah.
And the year really began in Egypt with the flooding of the Nile, which watered and fertilized the fields.
Sure.
There was a new cycle of life, and that began in Cancer with the rising of the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, the dog star. So it was the time of year when the Nile flooded, so Cancer, a water sign, and the moon, the most watery planet, are rising, connected with the flooding of the Nile, which is essential for the renewal of life. And at the same time, just after the flooding of the Nile, we have which is at the the time of the solstice, the summer solstice. It's a tremendously hot period, so the sun is very bright, and the combination of the water from the moon and the Cancer and the heat and light from the sun produces the crops that will sustain life for the next year.
All right, yeah. Well, it could be that also the fact that it's connected to the cosmic womb or something. I mean, as Cancer being the womb,
Right.
Originating, right?
Right. Well, and the other thing important is that these are the cardinal signs on the angles. Cancer opposite Capricorn, Aries opposite Libra. So the equinoxes are this axis, the solstices are this axis. And then because they had established that Cancer was rising, Leo was following, the signs fall in their natural order of the zodiac. But where do you place the other planets? They went in order of their distance. Saturn, being the most distant planet, is furthest from the sun and the moon, so it rules these two signs. Mercury is always near the sun, so it has to be adjacent to the sun. Venus is never more than 2 signs away from the sun, but further than Mercury, so it goes here. Mercury also goes here, and Venus goes here. It's a symmetry. After Venus comes Mars in terms of distance. Mars is here and here, then Jupiter here and here. And then Saturn is the planet that's furthest from both the light, sun, and the moon, so it rules Cancer and Aquarius. And this is the theory about why the planets rule the signs that they do. These are the dignities, and these are the most important dignities in Western astrology. The planets in their home signs, where they were at the birth of the universe, have a great deal of dignity.
Sure.
Now, the other interesting thing about this chart is Saturn is opposite the sun and the moon. So that in the theory of aspects, they said, well, when a planet is opposite something, it has somehow the nature of Saturn, because Saturn is connected to oppositions.
Yes.
And so that's considered a difficult placement. And in terms of dignities, the furthest place away from the sun is Aquarius. The furthest place away from the moon is Capricorn, both ruled by Saturn. And these were considered places of exile for the sun and the moon. The sun would be exiled here, furthest from its home. And the moon would be exiled here, furthest from its home.
Yes.
And so this was considered a debility, being exiled, or the term they used in Lily's time is in detriment. But the idea was, if all your resources are here, and this is the furthest place you can get from your home, you lack your resources here, you're in kind of an unfriendly or unhelpful position, and that's considered a debility or detriment. And so Mercury would be in exile or detriment in Pisces, and since Mercury rules Gemini, also in Sag, and so on. And so that's how the ideas of dignity and debility formed with regard to domicile. Well, let me just go through the aspects.
Sure.
The sun is in a trine to Jupiter. The sun is also in a trine to Aries. So this is a fire trine or trigon. And the sun later not later, but the sun was considered to be exalted in Aries. We'll talk about that later. And its a place of exaltation is in trine to the other 2 fire signs. Okay, let's go on. Exaltation. This is again Lily. If a significator is in his exaltation, where exaltation was lifted up, raised up, honored on high, and in no way impedited, meaning interfered with, but angular. It presents a person of haughty condition, arrogant, affirming more to him than is due. So this is a dignity, but it could come across as someone who's really arrogant because they think they're very much more important than they really are, which is interesting. And I think in one of the Arabic texts, I'm not sure if it's Mashallah or Abu Mashar, probably Mashallah, they talk about exaltation is a really good dignity if you're royalty, if you're a king or a prince, because it's fitting with your nature. But if you're a common person, you get this other, you think you're much better than you are aspect to it. So it has to do with
Right.
your status in society,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting.
Yes.
So if you're a king asking a question and your significators are in exaltation, that's great. But if you're just a commenter asking a question, you have something in exaltation, it might be good, but people are going to say, oh, this guy's full of it. He thinks he's much better than he is. He's a real ass. And so
Mm-hmm.
on. Okay, so Lily on exaltation. And here, exaltation really means exalted, being higher than everybody else. So these people regard the person sitting here to be in exaltation. And if these were his or her servants, if this is a monarch, then they would, if the monarch wants something, these people scurry to get it done. That's being an exaltation. Charlie Obert, he has a really good book on dignities. And I can't remember the exact title, but Charles Obert on dignities. So
Sure.
I'm going to quote him directly because he gives a really good explanation. A planet in exaltation receives honor and respect, but it does not have the management or control of rulership. So if you are a domicile ruler, you're in control of your own home. A man's home is his castle. If you're the exalted ruler, then you're in a place of honor and respect, and people do what you want because they hold you in this high esteem. It can mean being highly valued. Jupiter exalted in the second house of possessions, for example, can mean great wealth. Exaltation can also mean you are valued in the sense of being listened to and respected. It can have a psychological meaning connoting a person with high opinion of themselves. That's Lily's idea. And Lily regarded as linked to arrogance.
All right, so he connected really here. It's more something pejorative for him.
Well, it's a dignity, but
yeah.
in terms of the person, it's pejorative in the sense this is an arrogant person. He's still the king or he's still the prince. So I'm going to do what he wants, but I think he's really too haughty. He's too pompous for me. Okay.
So I'm just thinking about that. I mean, what that would actually mean, this way of thinking. You know, when a planet is in exaltation, which was considered the highest dignity, and then connect that to something that is, you know, arrogance and so on. How do you qualify?
Well, see, Lily's talking from a horary point of view. So
yes, sure.
So he would say, if, say, you want to negotiate with somebody, so you're the first house, they're the seventh house, but the ruler of the seventh house is in exaltation. So that person might be someone who really thinks he's quite special, and you might find him arrogant and obnoxious, but you'd still try to negotiate with him. It will really describe the person you're negotiating with.
Sure.
And he'll probably have an upper hand because he's exalted. I mean, everybody wants to do what he wants, and
do you see that happen in practice?
Well, actually, the example I'm going to go to is sort of the opposite. It's a planet in its fall, which is the opposite of exaltation. And so let's wait to look at that example.
Yeah, sure, because I'm just thinking about my own experience with casting charts for the moment. And I would never think of an exaltation position of a planet to give an adverse effect relating to the question or the person. It would be the opposite, in fact.
Sticking with that example, you're negotiating with somebody, the seventh house ruler is exalted. You've never met this person. So you go to meet them and it turns out they're the president of a company, or they come from a royal family. So that fits.
Yes.
Okay, so exaltations, some of the Hellenistic texts say that the exaltations really came from Babylonian astrologers, that they were incorporated from Babylonian sources into Hellenistic. And there are different theories about, nobody really knows why the Babylonians exalted planets in this way. The Babylonians apparently talked to planets signs having kind of secret rulers. There were the obvious rulers, like the domicile rulers, and then there were these secret rulers that were considered the exalted rulers. That's one theory about where they came from. So what I did was I took the Thema Mundi here, and I put here the domicile rulers, the glyphs, and then I put the exalted rulers in. And what struck me in doing that, and it's probably not original to me because different authors have commented about this. Some of the Hellenistic authors noted, for instance, that, well, let me show you I put the day or diurnal planets, Sun, Jupiter, Saturn, in red. The Hellenistic stars divided the chart into sect. There were day sect and night sect planets. The day sect was the Sun, Jupiter, Saturn, the sort of outermost planets, but the Sun. The night sect were linked to the moon, and they were Venus and Mars, and then Mercury could go either way depending on its relation to the Sun. In Hellenistic times, the angles of the chart, or the Kendra houses, I guess you use the same term in Vedic, right?
Yes, Kendra.
Were considered the axis of the universe. These, like, if you read Manilius, for example, he talks about the cardinal signs as being the axis that holds the universe together, that without the cardinal signs, the universe would just sort of have no orientation, no direction, things would fall apart. So the structure of the universe, it's like the structural foundation of a building, the inner structure is these signs. And it's interesting that each sign, cardinal sign, is a place of exaltation. The sun, the center of the universe, is in Aries at the top. Now, remember the throne? The throne being exalted means you're being held up high, like on a throne or on a pedestal. So in this diagram, the most exalted position is the sun, which may be one reason why the sun gets to Aries, because you can't get more exalted than right at the top.
Yes.
And in fact, in Babylonian times, and if you read the biography of Alexander the Great, he was fascinated by the idea that the Persian monarch had to be held in such high esteem that nobody in the same room as the monarch could have their head at a higher level than the monarch. So if the monarch sat, everybody's head had to be lower than his.
Yes.
So that there had to be this constant visual image of exaltation. The monarch always had to be the highest person in the room, literally the highest person in the room. And Alexander started asking his own soldiers to do that, and they objected because I think he was short to begin with. But anyway, but the idea, very literally, being exalted means being raised up above everybody else. And in this diagram, the Thema Mundi, the sun being the center of the solar system, is the most important planet. Everything revolves around the sun, and it gets the highest point in the chart. And it occurred to me looking at this, the sun was also the pharaoh in Egypt. And the pharaoh always had his wife, the moon, and his mistress, Venus. And so if you think of this as the throne room, we have the sun sitting up on his throne, and to this side is his wife a little lower, and to the other side is his mistress or concubine or consort. And then the sun is opposite Saturn in the solar system. The Saturn represents what is opposite. So this is daytime, this is nighttime. The Saturn has a similar position at nighttime. If you flip the chart over, Saturn is the most exalted planet at night. It gets the highest position.
Sure.
And then Jupiter and Mars are on the solstitial axis. And then this leaves Mercury. And I'm not sure why they would have put Mercury here. but in any case. But the exaltations are places where the planets are especially held in esteem, and whoever's present wants to do their bidding. One theory about Mars in Capricorn is that Mars is a hot, dry planet. And Capricorn is a very cold sign. And so the coldness of Capricorn helps temper the heat of Mars and helps it behave more reasonably.
Mm-hmm.
So that
I think Mercury is a very interesting sign because the planet has its Mula Trikona own sign
mm-hmm.
and exaltation there. You
right.
know, and also
the Trikona is also the Virgo, right?
Is also Virgo, so it has 3 points there. And also, if you look at Mercury's female sign,
mm-hmm.
I mean, Mercury in mythology is the child of the moon. There's this,
mm-hmm.
story that the moon had an affair with Jupiter's wife,
mm-hmm.
and out of that came Mercury. And so, moon and Mercury have a difficult relationship. Well, the moon considers Mercury difficult. There's different opinions on this. Some people say it's the other way around. But I think because Mercury in Virgo gets a certain intuitive ability as well. It's Mercury, it's discerning things, decoding things, and so on. So it has that
mm-hmm.
objectifying quality. But in a female sign, Mercury, because it is genetically, right, so to speak, related to the moon, it becomes also strongly connected to healing and all sorts of intuitive arts. And we often see it also in, astrology popping up, like people with planets in Virgo and so on. So I think it's a very interesting sign based on all these, connotations and the fact that it has its, all its dignities there. What's positive? I mean, Mula Trikona, exaltation, and own sign. And so I see it's also trining the moon, and it's also. So I'm not sure. I have to, think about it a little more. So what did you?
Well, I think it's one of the Hellenists or others does talk about the aspects of the planets, like Venus and the moon are favorably aspected to Venus, and the moon are favorably aspected to Cancer.
Mm-hmm.
The sun, Aries, is favorably aspected to Leo. Let's see. Jupiter's in Cancer, Mars is connected to Cancer. That they looked at the nature of the aspects linking the exalted positions to the sun and the moon as another possible explanation. And then they also looked at the opposition, like the sun is of the opposite nature of Saturn. So if the sun is exalted here, its opposite has to be exalted here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mars and Jupiter are opposites in a sense. And then Mercury and Venus are opposites in a sense.
Yes. Mm-hmm. How would you connect Jupiter and Mars being opposites? You mean in terms of looking at deriving some meaning from what these planets represent? Are you looking at that, or you're looking at something else?
Well, I mean, one thing that occurred to me, I don't think this is strictly Hellenistic, is that putting Jupiter in Cancer on the horizon, if you're in ancient Egypt, really makes sense because this is the period when the river overflows and brings new life to the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jupiter, the expansion of water,
mm-hmm.
and the horizon being new life. So the expansion, the flooding of the Nile begins life. I would interpret it that way. And Mars in Capricorn.
I think, sorry if I interrupt you about
go ahead. No, please do.
So because Jupiter is, of course, children, and of course, Cancer is the womb, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, and then we're going to say Mars?
Well, I was thinking of, Jupiter, children, Cancer, the womb, but this is really the rebirth of life in ancient Egypt. The Nile floods and the whole cycle, agricultural cycle starts over.
I mean, but it's symbolic. That's what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
Jupiter it is representing children, so it has that fertile, life-giving connotation.
Right, and then Mars is opposite the ascendant here, so it's the point where the sun sets, and basically you enter the underworld. You're dead here. and Mars is
Hmm.
kind of a killing planet. So Mars does its job by killing what was born and passing it on to the underworld.
Right. Hmm.
That's how I put it together.
You know, what's also, you can also look at it, if you look at Moon and Venus, Sun is sitting in the middle, then Moon is, you know, and Venus are next to the throne, we could say, right? But you can
Right.
also look at it from the sun's perspective. You can also look at the angles like that.
Mm-hmm.
On the one side is Jupiter, which is the counselor, let's say, the
Right.
king's counselor,
Mm-hmm.
and the other one is the army, which would be Mars.
Right.
So we have the council and the war, you know, the people who just fight for the, you know, to defend the country in an opposition, of course, in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, Saturn would be opposite of that, would be the underworld or the death of the king. So
Right.
it's very interesting what Mercury is actually doing there in this scheme. Yeah, right?
Right. Now, right. And in Greek mythology, Mercury was the only god that could travel freely between Mount Olympus and the underworld. There was a
Yes.
restriction. So
Yes,
it may
exactly.
be that Mercury's able to, to pass from here to here without
Mhm.
getting killed in the process.
Yes.
But it's interesting stuff.
Yes, it's interesting.
Let's
What's
go on to
true?
triplicity. So
Yes.
Lily on triplicity. He compares us to a man modestly endowed. So it's not as good as domicile or exaltation. So you're modestly endowed with goods and fortune. So you're reasonably well off. You're not rich and wealthy, but you're reasonably well off.
Mhm.
Prettily descended, you come from a good family, uh, and so on.
I think to talk about triplicity, which is a concept I, you know, came across a few years ago, getting more interested into the Hellenistic approach,
Mm-hmm.
because I was thinking, you know, looking at a natal chart. Of course, in Vedic astrology, we use divisional charts. So, for example, you see a planet Venus in Pisces, right? And then you have Venus
Mm-hmm.
is exalted in the whole sign of Pisces. But I mean, what is it doing exactly? You know, and you see many people's Venus is exalted, but they have different connotations, even with the same ascendant lord and so on. They have
Mm-hmm.
same different effects. So how are you going to differentiate more? And I thought triplicity was a very good concept.
It
Um,
is, yeah.
and because often we say in Vedic astrology, I mean, this is how it is. You can have a planet exalted in a natal chart, but then in your Chaturtamsha chart, which deals with the home more and wealth, it can be a debilitation or something.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on specific areas in life, you know, you're going to have certain good results or lesser results depending on the dignity. So it's difficult, sometimes challenging to qualify what a planet actually is going to deliver. You know, you can have.
Yeah. But
Um,
see, Dorotheus used triplicity kind of as a timing device as well.
mhm.
So that it was sort of like a little dasha system where the primary triplicity would be the beginning years of life, the middle years, and then the final years. Well, let me go to the table here.
Sure.
This is the Dorothean or Egyptian triplicities. Lilly used a different list that Ptolemy developed. This was the one that was used more in practice, so this is the one I go by. And so there are 4 different types of signs: fire signs, earth signs, air signs, water signs, and so on. And each group has 3 signs in it, so they're called triplicities because there's 3 signs. And then let's take fire signs, for example. If you're born during the day, your primary triplicity ruler is the sun. But if you're born at night, your primary triplicity ruler is Jupiter. It reverses. And then Saturn is always helping out to rule the triplicities. So each group of 3 fire signs has 3 rulers.
Yes.
And the sun has more importance in the day chart, Jupiter in the night chart, and Saturn is always there participating. And so what Dorotheus would do, he would say is, suppose you want to know about I don't know, your career, and you have a fire sign on your 10th house. And suppose you're born during the night, so that the first third of your life, Jupiter would rule your career development. And then the second third of your life, the sun would rule it. And the final third, Saturn would rule it. And then depending on the condition of those planets in your chart, you'd have a sense of how your career would develop.
Sure. So let's say you have a day chart, and then sun becomes
Right.
important.
The day chart, the sun would be the first. I mean, let's assume you're going to live 90 years. So the first 30 years to be sun years, the second 30 Jupiter years, and the final period Saturn years.
Okay, and that's for the timing system, but then also for, in terms of dignity itself, like if you were born during, let's say you're a Leo ascendant, so you're born during the day, so the sun becomes very important, obviously.
Right.
And then,
especially in childhood, early years will especially be affected by the sun and its condition in your chart. So if you have the sun and it's in great condition, you'll have a great childhood. But suppose you have the sun and it's squared by Saturn and opposed by Mars, and it's in its fall, so it's in Libra, right? You're probably going to have a difficult childhood, according to this theory. Now, the other thing in horary, what Bonatti did, if you have a question with multiple parts, you could assign a triplicity ruler to each part. Like, Bonatti gives the example of marriage. There's 3 women I'm thinking of marrying, and I have air on my 7th house cusp, my wife, my potential wife. So he would say the first woman that you're thinking of is Saturn, the second woman is Mercury, the third woman is Jupiter. Who is it best to marry? Well, you look at the condition of Saturn, Mercury, and Jupiter in your chart, and the one of those that is in best condition and that makes a good aspect to your ascendant, because you want a good aspect going on for the marriage, is the best one to marry. You can use the triplicity rulers to distinguish what each one is like and how they relate to your own ruler. During the day, the sun rules the day. So anything connected to the sun is going to be favored. It's going to be a little more potent, a little more favored. Anything connected to the moon is going to be less in favor because the moon rules the nighttime.
Sure.
And vice versa. So if you have a night chart, the moon and planets connected to the moon, which would be Venus and Mars, because they're nocturnal planets, are more favored.
Right.
And theoretically, how the even numbered houses, which are the lunar or feminine houses, would be more favored at nighttime.
Yeah, so that's also interesting to see, I think, and that's you call this an accidental dignity.
Right. A dignity is simply something that affects the behavior of the planet for better or worse.
Sure. That makes sense.
It can be essential, like a natural dignity. Being born into a royal family is a natural dignity. It just happened, right? You're just born with it.
Exactly.
But let's say Princess Diana married into the royal family, so that's an accidental dignity. She wasn't naturally a princess, but she was a commoner and married a prince, so she then gets this accidental royal dignity. It's not part of her nature, it's part of, she happened to be at the right place at the right time. At night, it's Moon, Venus, and Mars. Mercury can be either day or night, depending on whether it rises before or after the sun. So at night, Mars is a night planet, and the moon is ruling. So Mars gets a kind of boost. It's going to act more favorably. The way to think of it, the sun is the most important body in the solar system. It's the center. Everything revolves around the sun. And the 2 biggest other planets are Saturn and Jupiter, and they pair with the sun. And then the inner planets, the moon, Venus, and Mars, inner meaning inside Jupiter, go together, and they rule the nighttime. So at night, Mars is in a more favorable position. He's going to act better. In the daytime, the theory of elemental theory is Mars is naturally hot and dry. And if you put him in the daytime, the sun heats him up even more. So if you
Yeah,
have a hot-headed friend and then you heat him up a little, you give him a bottle of alcohol to drink.
Well, that's exactly, Sun Mars conjunctions are often like too much heat going on there.
Right, exactly. But you take your hot-headed friend to a bar, you give him a few drinks, what's going to happen? He's going to be in a fight.
Right. So Anthony, how extensively do you use this sun moon distinction, diurnal nocturnal, in terms of, you say because it's an accidental dignity, so you kind of favor these planets, that are with the sun more, and then during the night with the
you use it in interpretation. Like, suppose
yes.
there's a difficult aspect from Mars, and you want to know what's going to happen predictively. Well, if it's a night chart, it probably won't be as stressful as if it were a day chart.
That was
be a little more violent, a little more aggressive than a day chart, a little more destructive.
It's going to not determine the thing necessarily, but it will give a little extra to whatever is being analyzed from that point.
But it's also a synthesis. It's never one, as you know, one factor doesn't determine it. You could have a benefic that looks great, but that it could be in a really bad condition. And so it's going to manifest as not so great.
Yeah. I think this is a nice example of how, we see astronomical phenomena, right? Like the sun and then Jupiter and Saturn being the biggest, and then deriving some meaning from that. So I think this is a nice example that illustrates that how these astrological techniques are being developed, and also concepts.
Yeah. Okay. Term or bound. So term are these 5 little divisions in each sign. And Lily says, this is a dignity, but it tends to show more of the corporature and temper of the planet, meaning corporature is like the bodily composition and temper is like temperament. So he used these more as descriptive, like, well, here I said corporature means state of being, embodied bodily existence. So that he considered terms to really describe the people in the horary chart. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay. The idea here is that dignity has to do with regions of the zodiac. Certain regions of the zodiac are more familiar, more comfortable for a planet, and others are not.
Yes.
So the term is like you're in somebody's house or you're in a larger building, but you have your own little area. That's your term. And it reflects your corporature and temper. It reflects the kind of person you are. It describes you. So this guy, Matthew, has his man cave. This is his area. He's really at home here. He has dignity by term here. But maybe this is in his in-laws' house and they hate him. So once he steps out of his room and goes upstairs to the living room, his in-laws are going to hate him. It's going to be miserable. He won't be in dignity. So he'll retreat to his man cave and he'll have at least the dignity of term to comfort him.
All right.
Okay. Face or decan, Lily said this isn't really worth much, little or no dignity, almost like a man being ready to be turned out of doors, having much ado to maintain himself in credit and reputation. It's just like you have a little bit of dignity, but you're your last straw. Essential detriment is sort of the opposite of essential dignity. So this is due to the nature of the planet and where it is in the zodiac. It's in a unfriendly, unhelpful place, an inimical place, a place that's sort of contrary to its nature. So as we said, the detriment is opposite to the domicile. Domicile is the sign that you rule. Detriment or exile is opposite. Fall is opposite exaltation. And it's compared in the literature that it's like being in prison. And Lily says, beware of the effects of a planet in detriment rather than fall. So he thinks detriment's worse than fall. A planet in detriment is like a person cast out of his estate without hope of recovery, whereas fall shows present subjection to misfortune. with hope of recovery. Another image here. So here's Mars in Detriment in Libra. So Libra is this very refined, artistic sign, elegant, dainty, and we have Mars in Detriment, so it's like a bull in a china shop. So here's Mars in Detriment. He's not in his element. He's not in a Libran element. He wants to run around and break things, right? He's very Martian. So here's Mars in Detriment, Libra. Marinus on Detriment, which he calls exile. A planet in Detriment or exile occupies an incompatible sign in which it can express its own nature only in a poor or debased manner. The corrupting influence of being in an incompatible sign has a perverse effect. The planet behaves badly or improperly. If you think of the bull in the china shop, the nature of the bull is to run, crash into things, break things, but the china shop, it's incompatible with his nature. It has delicate things that are going to break easily. So you're putting this animal that will break things easily in a place where you want to be careful not to break anything. So there's this incompatibility, and then the behavior, the outcome isn't good. It just
So is that the same for Mars and Taurus?
It would be similar, yeah.
Would be a similar thing. Just the opposite of its own house, or own sign, rather. Yeah.
There's a certain incompatibility between the planet and the sign, so that the behavior is somehow distorted. It's not going to come out the way you want. A planet. This is a quote.
I mean, I can understand that in terms of, for example, Saturn and the Sun. If you look at what these planets represent, what they are, I can understand. And we discussed this before. You discussed this, when the Sun and Saturn. I mean, it's when the Sun is high, then Saturn is the opposite of that. But Mars and Venus, in the zodiac are important because with Mars and Venus we have hot, fire, and then Venus is going to be water. It means the water element. Then they are, two signs. They're next to each other, right? They're also opposite. And I see, Venus and Mars together, like Gemini has a certain sutra where he says that whenever Venus and Mars Rashi aspect a sign, it always gives a certain satisfaction as well, So I'm not sure.
So stereotypically, Mars is the warrior, it's the athlete, it's the person who really is assertive, aggressive, and Venus is more of the the negotiator, the conciliator, the person who wants to smooth things over and make things work just so without ruffling feathers. So so their agendas, their way of going about things are sort of almost opposite. Now, the interesting in mythology, when Mars and Venus get together, instead of fighting, they have sex. So, which I guess is sort of a mixture of the aggression and the. It's a good combination of Mars and Venus there.
Venus, and also, what I also think is very interesting is that because now we look at the signs. I mean, we have the signs, and then which in Vedic astrology are called the limbs of Vishnu because they're unconscious. They're, that's what they represent, body parts. And then you have, of course, the planets giving consciousness to the signs. So it's the signs that contain a planet's consciousness or limit the planet's consciousness. That's how they see it, right? And so we look at the planet and the sign as one, obviously, right? Because the planets cultivate their signs and so on. But I see in practice more and more, also with the work of Ernest Wilhelm, looking at planets and signs. I mean, the sign is one thing. You can look at, for example, Venus, let's say Taurus, right? And then Taurus, you can look at Venus, what is Venus doing in the horoscope? Its position, its aspected by, and so on. But then you also have the sign Taurus itself. So what is happening with Taurus? Because clearly it also represents very concrete things. And for example, when you have like a Saturn in Taurus or any planet in Taurus, it's gonna affect that sign itself. The ruler can be great, but then the sign itself can be affected. So
Venus and Mars are both of the night sect. They're both lunar planets of the lunar nighttime. And so even if they're in a difficult aspect, there's going to be some cooperation there because they belong to the same sect.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, so there's some other mitigating factors.
yeah, so I mean, it's never one factor.
No, it's not.
So Marinus says on Detriment here, let me just read this.
Sure.
The planet in detriment or exile acts according to its own nature, well, all planets do, and the nature of its dispositor. Okay, so if it's Mars in Venus in Taurus, it's going to act according to its Martian nature as well as its Venus nature. So it's going to try to act like Mars and like Venus at the same time in a depraved manner. Much more so if the dispositor occupies its own detriment or fall. So a lot has to do with, you have to look at, say Mars is in Taurus, it's going to act through Venus, but what is Venus doing in the chart?
Yes.
If Venus is in bad condition, Mars is going to act badly. If Venus is in good condition, it's not going to be such a problem.
See, and the thing is that, you know, what I have come about is that you look at the dignity, I mean, you look at the Lord, Venus in this case, and let's say Venus is an exaltation, it's in really good dignity, anger, and so on. But let's say you have the sun in Taurus. See, because the sun is not considered a good placement in Taurus, I mean, according to the natural relationships, because they're not compatible. You know, sun is focused, you know, it's like Venus is, Taurus is a Venus sign, but it's going to harm Venus. It's going to harm the sign, which is Taurus. And of course, the Lord is Venus. And the fact that that planet is there is going to have an impact on how Venus is acting herself. You know, regardless of its dignity and of its placement there. So I think that's very interesting to think about. They're always connected, but at the same time, the sign is also a sign. It's also something. It has its own life. It's an archetype. You know, we have the planets are archetypes, but then also we have the signs, and they're very similar. There's so many overlap, but at the same time, it's also a world of its own.
Now, what's interesting about this quote is Marinus brings in the enemies of the planets. He says if the dispositor, which would be Venus in this case, the dispositor of Mars and Taurus would be Venus. If Venus happens to be in the sign of an enemy, that Mars is going to behave badly.
Yes.
That's interesting. Okay, so an image for detriment or exile, like being on Skid Row, is just a metaphor for being really down and out and without resources, in an unfavorable environment and in a state of discontent. So, and the idea is that a planet, if it's really in an area of the zodiac where it feels discontented, it's not going to act well. It's going to act badly. Okay. So I think some examples. Now, this is the tropical chart of Hitler. If we did the sidereal chart, I guess we would subtract about 24 degrees from everything. But let's do the tropical chart. Moon, Mars, and Saturn are in detriment. So here's Moon is in Capricorn, opposite Cancer, so it's in exile or detriment. So he has an undignified Moon. Mars, oh, here's Mars in Taurus. That's what we were just talking about. Mars in Taurus, and in the not whole sign but tropical quadrant sign, it's angular, so it's pretty powerful. It's disposed by Venus, who's in Taurus, so she's very powerful. Retrograde, which we considered somewhat of a debility, and then Saturn is in Leo, opposite Aquarius, so Saturn is in detriment. Jupiter, where's Jupiter? Is in Capricorn in his fall. So Jupiter is not very happy. He's miserable. The Sun, Moon, and Mercury are peregrine, meaning they have no dignity at all, no essential dignity. And so if we shifted this to sidereal, we'd have Mars in Aries with Venus in Aries. So Venus would be in detriment, right? Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
and Mars would be quite powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And Saturn would shift into Cancer, so Saturn would be very powerful too.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So, I mean, this is an interesting chart. I think the dignities are very important because on the surface of it, if you don't look at the dignities, it looks like a very powerful chart.
Yeah.
Maybe a good chart.
Mm-hmm.
Because in these tropical, Venus rules the ascendant and it's in Taurus. It is afflicted by Mars and it's quite a strong affliction. They're almost exactly conjunct. Just the dignities for Hitler's chart. This is a typical set of dignities. The P stands for peregrine, meaning it has no essential dignity. So the Moon, Sun, Mercury, and Mars have no essential dignity
Mm-hmm.
in this system. Venus has dignity as a ruler and by triplicity. So Venus is quite powerful in this chart. Charles Obert on fall. By contrast with exaltation, a planet in fall is not listened to, not respected, in disgrace. It connotes downfall, slavery, servitude. Feels ignored, may be driven to act in an unbalanced way to get attention and respect.
Mm-hmm.
Marinus says a planet in fall is weakened in its efforts to act according to its own nature.
In Vedic astrology, it's referred to as Kala Avasta, or Avasta means condition, and it translates as pressed or pressed or depressed even.
Depressed, yeah. Sometimes in the Western, they call it the depression, or yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So fall depression. An image for being in fall. It's like being enslaved, disrespected, subordinated to the will of others. So here's a slave in fall. Has no, it's certainly not an exalted state. It's the opposite of exaltation.
Mm-hmm.
There's an interesting in Hellenistic terms. This is generally ignored, but some of the Hellenistic astrologers talked about the individual degrees as dignities.
Mm-hmm.
And so each degree is assigned to a planet, and the planet has a certain dignity there. That's rarely ever used, but I just mentioned in passing.
Mm-hmm.
So I mentioned Charles and Diana. So this is the chart for the start of their wedding, which was 11:20 in the morning. And then they actually exchanged vows maybe 9-10 minutes later,
Mm-hmm.
or 8 minutes later. But this is, I was interested to see if this chart would show in the dignities that they ended up divorcing, obviously, and they didn't have a great marriage. So the ascendant here is in Libra. And so that would represent the event itself. And Venus rules Libra is in fall, it's in Virgo.
Mm-hmm.
So not a great start for a wedding, because you plan the event when the ascendant ruler, which represents the event itself, is in a state of fall.
Oh yeah. Well, and also there's like a hidden aspect. Also, there's something in the 12th could also connect to that.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we take the 7th to be the marriage itself, that's ruled by Mars. Mars is also, he's in detriment, right? No, he's in fall.
He's in fall, yeah.
So we have the 2 primary rulers in fall, which is interesting, given how the wedding worked out.
Mm-hmm.
So if we just look at this as an elected chart.
It was also during a new moon, I
right.
see. And considered in Vedic astrology, the new moons are not considered very auspicious, especially in triggered transits, because moon is combust, right? It's behind the rays of the sun are obscured. So whatever moon represents, and of course moon is a relationship planet, connects to women and so on. So it has all these connotations as well.
But I thought this was just an interesting chart to
look at the fall, definitely, and detriment. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I made a note here that there's this interesting, very close conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn right near the ascendant.
Mm-hmm.
Saturn rules the 5th of children.
Mhm.
Jupiter is a symbol of children, and they're conjunct, so that this marriage should produce children, right?
Yes.
By this aspect. Okay.
Also, in Vedic astrology, Jupiter and Saturn conjunctions are strong indicators for childbirth because Saturn crystallizes, Jupiter is the represents children.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So the Sun was quite strong in Leo in the
Right, the
11th
Sun very strong in Leo. Yeah.
with the North Node, so a strong karmic event.
Mm-hmm.
Also, what do we have here? The fifth lord, the seventh lord was Mars, while Jupiter is. What was the fifth lord? What was Jupiter again here? Because I'm not used to looking at these.
Jupiter is the third.
And what is it?
And the sixth lord.
And the sixth lord as well, because we have the sixth lord. Because I see Jupiter and Saturn are strongly squaring. Mm-hmm. Excuse me, Mars and Jupiter.
Yeah.
And also Mars and Saturn. I think that's always difficult. It's always a very frustrating aspect whenever Mars and Saturn are tight,
Mm-hmm. And what was interesting to me, I looked at this, if we move the ascendant to about 9 or 10 of Libra, which is when they actually exchange their vows,
mm-hmm.
and then the primary direction of the ascendant to Pluto comes to 1996, which is when they divorced.
All right.
So that was interesting.
Yes.
Okay, so the final chart here. This is a chart from the there's a book by Mashallah from the 8th century, I think, about horror astrology.
Yes, I remember you talking about him. Yeah.
So this is not exactly identical to the chart because his degree positions are maybe a degree off from this. I couldn't exactly recreate his chart because I think he used a different set of tables. So this is a sidereal chart with the Raman Ayanamsha, which is very close to the chart he used, but it's slightly different. Okay. And so here's a man who says, will I acquire a kingdom? Meaning he wanted to be in charge of a certain area of the kingdom, right? He lives in, this must be Persia, and he wants to rule a certain region of the country. So he applies to be the governor of this region. So he is indicated by the moon because Cancer rises. And the person he applies to is indicated by Saturn, which rules the 7th house. So this is the person who can make the decision, will he get this kingdom or not? Will he get this position, government position? The position itself is ruled by the 10th house, and Saturn happens to be in the 10th, so it's kind of fitting.
All right.
And so Mashallah says, well, let's look. He's the moon. The moon is applying, and it will exactly oppose Saturn soon. So he should get the position. In fact, the moon is in Libra. So the moon is a place that Saturn really likes. Saturn is exalted in Libra. So the moon is applying to Saturn, the guy who can give him this government job, from a place of exaltation of Saturn. So he says, this means he's going to get the job. And when he's going to get it has to do with when the moon is going to oppose the Saturn, because that brings them together exactly, that opposition. But he says, because it's an opposition, this is going to be a struggle. He's going to really have to work to get this job. It won't be easy. And he says he's not going to like this job because Saturn is in Aries, which is his fall. So the moon is in a place that Saturn loves. So Saturn's going to help the moon out. But Saturn is in a place that Saturn hates. It hates being in fall. It's like that slave being, held up on the ship. Really miserable.
Absolutely.
So he's going to get this job, but the job, he's going to hate the job.
I think it's also the 10th lord is stability. It's also in its fall on the ascendant.
Yeah. Now, he didn't use the 10th lord in this example. Interestingly, he just used the moon and Saturn because this guy's applying to this guy to get this position. And he says the guy's going to hate the position. He's just going to hate it. And
And he did.
Yeah, he did hate it. Where did I put the, I want to read from,
Sure.
actually, this is Ben Dyke's translation.
Cool.
Just
Yeah, he's great.
so this is Ben Dyke's, this is quoting Mashallah. I looked at the question, and I looked at the Lord of the Ascendant, which is the moon, and the moon is joined to Saturn from Saturn's exaltation in Libra, so that Saturn receives the moon from Saturn's exaltation, which signifies the affecting of the matter, and thus he'll get the job. And then he says, but this will not be until it is striven for by the asker of the question. And there will be difficulty and labor because Saturn receives the moon by opposition. And let's see, blah, blah, blah. And then the outcome, let me read the outcome. He says, the outcome was that the man the outcome was of little advantage. He did not find what he was striving for except for a middling thing. But he did receive his authority and his time in it. I'm not sure about Ben's translation of this because I don't have the Latin. But anyway, he says that the smallness of the usefulness of this position came about because of the fact that Saturn, who decreed the kingdom to him, was in the sign of his own fall or dissension, of evil and worthlessness, and in his well or pit. Now that's another debility. Lilly uses this idea of pitted degrees. They're again single degrees. In Mashalah's chart, Saturn's not in 11, but it's in 10 of Aries. And 10 of Aries was considered a pit, which is a degree where any planet there falls in the pit, or like falls down a well. And what's interesting is that was considered, that could be either good or bad. So if it's a malefic like Saturn, this could do harm, but it falls in a pit, then that's probably good because it can't do as much harm. It's fallen down the well, so it's not up where it can hurt you as much. So it's another way that Lilly used this idea, and Mashallah used it, and Abu Mashar used it, the idea of falling in the pit. And in each sign, there's certain degrees that are pits. So I don't know. But anyway, so those
I
were
think if I look at the chart itself, I'm thinking besides what you've been discussing, I think if I would look at it, I would also consider, I mean, of course, we have the querents being the moon, and then also the job. I would definitely also look at the 10th house. I mean, like Mars, for example.
And Mars, yeah.
And here we see that moon is going to trine that Mars.
Right.
Well, it's going to take some time. It's going to, but you know, Mars would then be in its fall, and Moon would arrive at its debilitation, or also at its fall, right? In Scorpio. So I think it's always whenever you see, also when I look at these old examples, like given in old books, also from the Vedic angle, but also I've seen it with these Hellenistic texts, then you can always see it from multiple angles. And it's always very interesting. They always gives you, okay, just follow this thread. This is what I'm talking about. But at the same time, you can see so many things confirming it. And so.
Oh, yeah, I think, here I put the dignities here. Right, so the moon is in this exaltation of Saturn. So Saturn really is happy with the moon, because the moon is in a place that Saturn loves. But Saturn is in his fall, so Saturn is in a place that Saturn hates. And
it's also especially because Saturn's lord is also debilitated, you know.
right.
Because
Yeah.
let's say that Mars would be exalted. I mean, you know, Saturn is going to be debilitated, but its lord is good. You know, it can help.
Right. Mars is only in his own term.
So Mars is not doing great either. I mean, it's not that bad.
Well, he has a little bit of dignity, but it's
Yeah.
just he's in his own term.
Mm-hmm.
And so he got the job, but he really didn't like it. He was miserable there.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Anything else? In the example, he focused on the moon and Saturn as the key indicators and what they were doing.
Sure. Also, a moon, like a Sun-Saturn conjunction, is always difficult, you know, because these are so volatile.
If we take the 10th house, 10th
Yeah.
sign to be the position, we do have the sun there in a sign of exaltation.
Yeah.
So it may be that he's looking at this as being much better than it is because Saturn is there screwing it up.
Yes.
In fall. So this is sort of a combination of you have a Saturn in fall.
Yes.
And the sun in exaltation, both in the same 10th house, both describing the job. I guess Saturn's more prominent. The sun is about to leave the sign. It's toward the end. It's not as potent, probably.
Yes, yes.
But here we have a planet in exaltation, which may describe the job, but in the sense of arrogance, like it's much better than it looks. It's not as good as it looks. It thinks it's much better than it is. See, I think it goes way back to Babylonian times, and we don't have original sources for some of this. Concepts got carried forward from Babylonian times to Hellenistic and through Vedic, into India, but we may not know why originally they thought what they did. We have to sort of guess at it.
The strongest idea wins, right? Thank you very much for sharing this and for putting all the work.
Sure. Okay.
And, how can people reach you, Anthony?
Well, I do have a blog that it's Tony Lewis at WordPress.
WordPress.
They Google that, yeah.
I'll just put a link. I always do. Yeah. You wrote a book on horary astrology, so you people can contact you for that.
Yeah, my books are on Amazon. Yeah,
it's on Amazon. What is it called?
Horary Astrology, plain and simple.
Okay, thank you.
See you soon. Okay. Thank you.